Remembering King Charles I and the English Civil War A commemoration outside Buckingham Palace, 4K. A soft golden light from the rising sun glinted off the palace gates, casting long, gentle shadows across the cobblestones. Though the city buzzed with its usual weekday energy, this small square near the palace seemed almost separate from the ordinary rhythm of London. People gathered slowly, in small clusters, drawn by a sense of curiosity and reverence. This was not a protest, a parade, or a celebration of the modern monarchy. It was a commemoration, a quiet remembrance of a king who lived centuries ago, and a civil war that had shaped the very history of England. The crowd was modest, but there was a surprising diversity among those who had come. Elderly men and women, their faces lined with time and wisdom, walked slowly, leaning slightly on canes or each other, their eyes scanning the palace facade as though seeking glimpses of the past. Young students in school uniforms clustered near the edges of the gathering, their notebooks ready, eager to capture something that might otherwise remain a distant story. Families with small children held hands and whispered explanations of the day's significance, attempting to make the weight of history understandable to those too young to grasp it fully. A few tourists, cameras dangling from their necks, lingered nearby, drawn by the sight of the palace and the unusual gathering. They paused politely, listening to murmurs and glances exchanged among the crowd, unsure but respectful of the solemnity of the event. Among the attendees were also a few people whose connection to history went beyond curiosity. Historians, authors, and researchers carried folders and binders, prepared to take notes, make observations, and perhaps later publish their thoughts. They spoke softly to one another, pointing out architectural details of the palace, discussing historical events with a quiet intensity, and occasionally nodding toward the palace gates, where the ceremonial banners of the British monarchy flapped gently in the morning breeze. Some of these scholars were dressed formally, with long coats and scarves, while others were more casual, yet their eyes betrayed a sharp awareness of the weight of the past. To them, this was not just an event. It was a connection to centuries of human experience, a chance to witness the remembrance of a story they had studied for years. The square itself seemed to hold its breath in anticipation. Buckingham Palace, with its grand stone facade, tall windows, and intricately carved balconies, towered over the gathering, a silent witness to the centuries. Its familiar, regal presence felt different on this day, not as a backdrop for tourist photos or royal pomp, but as a keeper of memory. The palace's gates, polished to a gleaming finish, reflected the morning light and the faces of the crowd. Even the pigeons that occasionally fluttered across the square moved with a certain calm, as if sensing the unusual stillness among the people below. The air was filled with quiet murmurs, occasional coughs, and the subtle rustle of coats and scarves as people adjusted themselves to stand comfortably on the cold stones. A few moments of silence passed as the gathering grew slowly, punctuated only by the soft steps of late arrivals and the distant sounds of London's morning traffic. Conversations were hushed, respectful, often beginning with tentative questions and answers about the day's significance. One young girl, barely 10, tugged at her mother's sleeve and asked why everyone was there. Her mother explained in soft tones about King Charles I, about the English Civil War, and the importance of remembering history. The girl's eyes widened as she tried to picture soldiers on horseback, banners waving, and people debating fiercely about loyalty and power. Nearby, an elderly man with silver hair nodded in agreement, adding quietly that it was not just about battles or politics, but about understanding the choices people made and the consequences they faced. The atmosphere was quietly vibrant in its own way. People were not loud or boisterous, but there was a shared energy in the anticipation of what was to come. Some attendees had brought small flags or replicas of historical items, carefully holding them as though they were sacred relics. Others simply stood with their hands clasped, their faces reflecting a mix of curiosity, respect, and reflection. Every so often, someone would glance at a companion and whisper a comment about the palace, the history, or the significance of the day. Even without words, there was a sense of connection, a silent understanding that they were all there to honor something larger than themselves, a shared history that had shaped the nation in ways both subtle and profound. As the crowd continued to grow, the historical context of the commemoration became more visible. Small displays were set up along the edges of the square, showing portraits of King Charles I, maps of the English Civil War, and images of the people who had lived through that tumultuous time. There were simple descriptions beneath each display, written in clear language for all ages, explaining who the figures were, what events had taken place, and why these moments mattered. Children leaned forward eagerly, pointing to the images and asking questions that drew patient, thoughtful answers from parents, teachers, and guides. The displays were modest but powerful, a bridge between the distant past and the present moment, inviting everyone to step into the lives of those who had lived centuries before. Among the attendees, a few individuals stood out for their unique connection to history. One elderly woman clutched a worn, leather-bound notebook, her fingers tracing the edges as if drawing strength from it. She had spent her life studying the Stuart period and often gave lectures at local historical societies. Today, she was here not to teach but to witness, to participate in a living memory of the past. Nearby, a young man with a camera adjusted his lens carefully, trying to capture the morning light on the palace gates and the faces of the crowd. He was not a professional photographer, but he understood the importance of preserving these moments. Every click of his shutter was a quiet act of remembrance, a way of ensuring that future generations could see what had been here that morning. Even the sounds of the city seemed to soften around the square. The usual hum of traffic, the occasional shout from a distant street, and the clang of bus bells faded into the background, replaced by the quiet footsteps, murmurs, and whispers of those gathered. The wind carried the faint echo of history, a reminder that the events being remembered were not just stories in books but real experiences that had shaped lives, families, and the nation itself. It was as if the very air held memory, connecting the people of today with the kings, soldiers, and citizens of centuries past. As the first rays of sunlight touched the palace balconies, the crowd began to take in the full scene before them. The banners of the monarchy flapped gently, the portraits and displays were being examined carefully, and conversations continued in hushed tones. There was a sense of anticipation in the air, an unspoken understanding that soon the formal commemoration would begin. Yet even in this quiet, waiting phase, the people felt a deep connection to history, a realization that they were participating in something meaningful. They were not merely spectators, they were witnesses, part of a chain of memory that stretched back through time. Slowly, the crowd settled into small groups, forming natural circles around the displays and the central open space of the square. Teachers spoke to students, guides explained the significance of each image, and individuals reflected silently, lost in thought. The scene was alive with quiet activity, each person moving at their own pace, engaging with the history in a personal way. The energy was subtle but palpable, a gentle current of curiosity, respect, and human connection. It was a moment where past and present met, where history was not just remembered but felt, lived, and honored. And so, as the morning unfolded outside Buckingham Palace, the stage was quietly set for a day of reflection, remembrance, and learning. The crowd, a mix of ages, backgrounds, and purposes, had come together for a single reason: to honor the memory of King Charles I and the events of the English Civil War. Each person brought their own story, their own understanding, and their own respect, adding layers of meaning to the gathering. In the calm, crisp air of the early morning, with the palace standing tall and silent, the people of today prepared to connect with the lives, choices, and struggles of those who had lived centuries before, ready to carry their memory forward. As the morning progressed, the crowd outside Buckingham Palace slowly shifted their attention from the palace itself to the historical displays carefully arranged along the square. Portraits of King Charles I stood tall, their painted eyes staring out as if silently narrating the story of a man who had lived and ruled over England centuries ago. The king's elegant attire, the regal lace collars, and the fine details of his robes spoke of wealth and power, but the expressions on his face hinted at the weight of responsibility, the difficult decisions, and the personal struggles that marked his life. People leaned forward, examining every brushstroke, every line etched into the painted faces, as if trying to connect with the human being behind the image. The historian leading the commemoration began speaking quietly, his voice calm but filled with authority. He explained how King Charles I had ascended the throne during a turbulent time, a period when England was divided between royal authority and the growing power of Parliament. The crowd listened attentively, some nodding slowly, others scribbling notes. Even the children, initially distracted by the occasional fluttering bird or passing tourist, seemed drawn to his words. He told stories of the king's early life, his education, and the pressures he faced from the moment he wore the crown. It was a time when every decision mattered, when every choice could alter the lives of thousands, and when the consequences of misjudgment could be fatal. As the historian spoke, the narrative shifted naturally to the English Civil War, a series of conflicts that had torn the country apart. He described how families, towns, and even friends had found themselves on opposite sides of the conflict, driven by beliefs, loyalties, or simple survival. The audience could almost hear the sounds of distant battlefields, the clashing of swords, and the drumbeats that once echoed across the countryside. The story was not told merely as dates and events, but as real human experiences, highlighting the courage, fear, and sacrifices of those who lived through the war. One elderly man in the crowd whispered to his companion about his own family, explaining that his ancestors had served in local militias, fighting not for glory but to protect their homes. The historian paused and nodded at the man, acknowledging the living connection between the past and the present. Nearby, children circled around an illustrated map that depicted the key battles and movements of both the royalists and the parliamentarians. They pointed excitedly at small icons representing armies and cities, asking questions about why the battles had happened and how ordinary people had survived during such dangerous times. Parents and teachers responded patiently, using simple words to explain complicated events. They spoke of strategy and loyalty, of courage and fear, and of the countless ordinary people whose lives were forever changed by decisions made far from their homes. A young boy asked if anyone had ever tried to stop the war entirely, and the teacher smiled gently, explaining that many people had worked for peace, but history often moves in ways that are beyond the control of individuals. The children listened, captivated by the idea that history was not just a story in books, but a collection of real lives and real choices. As attention returned to the portraits, the historian began to highlight King Charles I's personal character. He spoke of the king's deep religious beliefs, his love for art, and his dedication to the responsibilities of ruling a nation. He also explained the difficult decisions that had led to the conflict, including the king's belief in the divine right of kings and his struggle with a parliament that sought to limit his power. The audience could see the tension in every decision Charles had made, the delicate balance between duty and principle. The story humanized the king, not as a distant figure of legend, but as a man who faced the same fears, doubts, and hopes that any human being might experience when confronted with impossible choices. The narrative shifted again, this time focusing on the ordinary citizens who lived through the war. The historian described towns disrupted by battles, families forced to flee their homes, and farmers whose fields were trampled by marching armies. Letters written by soldiers and civilians were read aloud, revealing the emotions, hopes, and fears of people who had endured hardship, uncertainty, and loss. One woman in the crowd dabbed her eyes discreetly as she listened, moved by the story of a young mother who had hidden her children during a siege. The historian emphasized that history is not only about kings and generals, but also about the countless unnamed people whose resilience and courage shaped the world in ways that are often overlooked. A young man with a notebook scribbled down every detail, his eyes flicking between the historian and the portraits. He was writing a paper for school, but more than that, he seemed genuinely captivated by the lives of those who had come before him. He asked questions quietly, seeking clarification on points that others might have missed. Nearby, an older couple held hands and shared their own reflections, recalling stories passed down from their grandparents about family connections to the events of the 17th century. The historian encouraged these interactions, knowing that the true power of history lies in personal connections, in the way stories are remembered, discussed, and passed on. As the morning wore on, small groups of people wandered to the side displays that illustrated the culture of the time. Books, coins, clothing, and sketches of architecture helped the audience imagine daily life in 17th century England. Children tried on small replicas of helmets and hats, giggling as they saw themselves in the mirrors. Adults examined the delicate prints of historical documents, marveling at the care with which words were written by hand in an age long before computers or typewriters. The historian guided them through each artifact, explaining its significance and how it connected to the larger story of the Civil War and King Charles I's reign. The crowd learned not just about battles and politics, but also about the richness of culture, the values of the time, and the human stories behind historical events. A subtle change came over the crowd as the stories of hardship and resilience unfolded. Faces that had been merely curious now reflected empathy and understanding. People exchanged glances, silently acknowledging the courage of those who had lived in such uncertain times. A few people closed their eyes briefly, imagining the sounds of distant cannon fire, the cries of townspeople, and the quiet moments of hope and prayer that must have sustained them. Even the youngest children, though unable to fully grasp the political intricacies, seemed moved by the idea that ordinary people had faced extraordinary challenges and had found ways to survive, care for one another, and maintain hope. The historian also highlighted moments of reconciliation, moments when enemies had shown compassion, and stories of individuals who had tried to bridge divides despite the chaos. He emphasized that even in the darkest times, humanity could shine through acts of kindness, bravery, and selflessness. One visitor, a teacher, quietly remarked to her student group that these lessons were as important today as they had been 400 years ago, reminding everyone that history is not only about what happened, but about what we choose to remember and learn from it. The morning passed in a steady rhythm of observation, conversation, and reflection. Some people moved from one display to another, while others stayed in one place, lost in thought. A few journalists quietly took notes, hoping to capture the essence of the event for their readers. Families walked together slowly, discussing the historical stories in a way that connected the past to their own lives. The air was filled with curiosity, learning, and a shared sense of purpose. Though no one shouted or cheered, there was a subtle energy that bound the crowd together, a sense that they were all participating in something larger than themselves, a living memory of history. By late morning, the audience had developed a quiet rhythm of engagement. They moved seamlessly between learning about King Charles I, the Civil War, and the lives of ordinary people, taking in details, asking questions, and reflecting silently. The historian's voice continued to guide them, but increasingly, it was the crowd itself that carried the energy of the event. Conversations sparked curiosity, curiosity led to questions, and questions deepened understanding. The gathering had transformed from a simple observation into an immersive experience of history, one that engaged the mind, touched the heart, and connected individuals to the lives of those who had come centuries before. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, illuminating the palace and the square, a sense of unity settled over the crowd. People began to understand that history is more than names, dates, and events. It is a collection of human experiences, decisions, and emotions that continue to resonate. King Charles I and the English Civil War were no longer distant stories. They were real, tangible, and deeply meaningful to everyone present. The crowd outside Buckingham Palace had become part of a continuum, a living reminder that remembering history allows us to honor the past, understand the present, and prepare for the future. As the morning deepened into late hours, a gentle hush began to settle over the crowd. Outside Buckingham Palace, the quiet anticipation signaled the beginning of the commemorative ceremony. The central square, which had been filled with small groups wandering among the displays and portraits, gradually became more focused as people gravitated toward the open area at the front. There was a natural rhythm to this movement, almost as if the palace itself were guiding them toward the heart of the remembrance. Parents held the hands of their children, teachers shepherded students, and individuals who had arrived alone found themselves standing near others who shared their curiosity and respect for history. Everyone seemed to sense that something significant was about to unfold, a moment when the past and present would meet in quiet reverence. The ceremony began simply, without grand fanfare or extravagant display. The organizer stepped forward, a historian whose calm presence carried a weight of authority, and addressed the crowd in soft, clear tones. He welcomed everyone, explaining the purpose of the gathering, to remember King Charles I, the trials of his reign, and the events of the English Civil War. He reminded the audience that history is not only about battles and politics, but also about the human experiences behind them, about families, children, soldiers, and ordinary citizens whose lives were touched by the turbulence of the era. His words were measured, respectful, and accessible, allowing the crowd to focus on reflection rather than spectacle. One of the first elements of the ceremony was the laying of wreaths. A group of attendees, carefully selected from historians, family descendants, and local representatives, approached the central area. Each carried a simple but elegant wreath, composed of white and red flowers, symbolizing purity, remembrance, and respect. The act was deliberate and solemn, almost meditative, as if the flowers themselves carried the weight of centuries. The audience watched silently, some bowing their heads, others closing their eyes, imagining the lives and struggles represented by the ceremony. The combination of visual beauty, symbolism, and quiet reflection created a profound sense of connection to the past. A small choir began to sing, their voices soft but resonant, echoing gently across the square. The melody was solemn, almost timeless, with harmonies that seemed to stretch beyond the moment and reach into the centuries. The music did not demand attention through volume or extravagance. Instead, it invited contemplation. Listeners found themselves drawn into the sound, letting it wash over them, connecting them emotionally to the stories they had learned earlier in the day. Some of the children, initially fidgety, sat quietly on the ground, mesmerized by the harmony, while older attendees felt a gentle stirring of emotion, recalling the sacrifices and courage of those who had lived during the English Civil War. The historian guiding the ceremony then recounted key moments of King Charles I's reign, focusing on his personal character, his decisions, and the challenges he faced. He spoke of the king's commitment to duty, his religious devotion, and his struggle to maintain unity in a divided nation. The audience listened intently, captivated not by grand heroic tales, but by the nuanced portrayal of a man trying to navigate impossible circumstances. In telling the king's story, the historian also acknowledged the moral complexity of the time, the difficult choices, the misunderstandings, and the consequences that followed. This was not a tale of simple victory or defeat. It was a story of human experience, rich in lessons and reflection. As the story unfolded, the ceremony incorporated personal accounts drawn from historical letters and diaries. Volunteers read aloud words written by soldiers, citizens, and family members who had endured the turmoil of the Civil War. The voices were calm but filled with emotion, conveying fear, hope, grief, and resilience. The audience was struck by the human element of history, understanding that behind every battle, every decree, and every political decision were real lives, full of ordinary joys and hardships. An elderly woman in the crowd held a small notebook, tears forming in her eyes as she listened to a letter written by a mother hiding her children during a siege. Nearby, a young student took careful notes, fascinated by the way history could feel so immediate and personal, despite being centuries old. The ceremony also included moments of symbolic reflection. A single candle was lit and placed near the portraits of King Charles I, representing the light of memory and the endurance of history. Its gentle flame flickered in the morning breeze, drawing the gaze of many attendees. Children watched with wide eyes, asking their parents why a single candle could be so important. The answers were simple but profound. The candle symbolized remembrance, hope, and the way stories of the past continue to shine, even through the darkness of conflict and time. The small act of lighting the candle became a shared experience, connecting each individual in the crowd to the ceremony and to the lives being honored. During the ceremony, the historian encouraged attendees to share their reflections quietly, fostering a sense of participation. People whispered their thoughts to neighbors, shared stories of family history, or simply reflected silently. A young teacher described to her students how the lessons of history could be applied to everyday life, understanding others, making ethical decisions, and appreciating the sacrifices of those who came before. Nearby, a man in his 40s who had traveled from another city quietly noted in his journal that the ceremony made history feel alive, something not just read about but experienced. The collective atmosphere was one of engagement and respect, where every gesture, word, and thought contributed to the living memory of the past. As the ceremony progressed, attention turned to the children in attendance, who were invited to participate in a small, symbolic gesture. Each child received a small card with an illustration of King Charles I and a brief description of his life and significance. They were asked to place the cards carefully at the foot of the wreaths, a symbolic act of learning, respect, and remembrance. Some children hesitated, unsure of the meaning, but guidance from parents and teachers helped them understand that their actions, however small, were part of honoring history. The sight of children engaging in this quiet, meaningful act brought a gentle warmth to the ceremony, reinforcing the continuity of memory across generations. The historian then spoke of reconciliation and reflection, emphasizing that the events of the English Civil War, though marked by conflict and tragedy, also contained moments of understanding, courage, and humanity. He highlighted individuals who had worked to protect civilians, to show mercy to enemies, and to heal divisions within their communities. The audience listened closely, reflecting on how, even in times of great strife, human kindness and moral courage can persist. An older couple shared a quiet smile, acknowledging the importance of these lessons for their own lives and for the children who stood nearby. The ceremony, though rooted in history, was increasingly becoming a moment of shared reflection on values, ethics, and human connection. The ceremony reached its quiet climax as a moment of silence was observed. The crowd stood together, heads bowed, hands clasped, or arms at their sides. In that stillness, the sounds of the modern city faded into the background, the distant hum of traffic, the faint cries of birds, even the gentle wind seemed to quiet itself. For several minutes, the people were transported across time, imagining the life of King Charles I, the struggles of ordinary citizens, and the profound impact of the English Civil War. It was a shared experience, yet deeply personal, as each individual connected in their own way to the lives, choices, and sacrifices of those being remembered. When the moment of silence ended, a gentle applause arose, not out of celebration but as a recognition of the lives remembered and the lessons learned. The historian spoke one final time, thanking the audience for participating, for honoring the past, and for carrying forward the memory of King Charles I and the English Civil War. The crowd dispersed slowly, some lingering to look again at the portraits and wreaths, others quietly discussing what they had learned and felt. There was a sense of satisfaction, of having been part of something meaningful, even if intangible. As the ceremony concluded, the atmosphere remained calm, but filled with a lingering sense of connection. People walked away with a renewed understanding of history, aware that the events of centuries ago continued to shape the present. Some planned to research more, others intended to share the stories with friends or family, and children carried with them the symbolic cards and the lessons of courage, resilience, and reflection. The square outside Buckingham Palace, which had been quiet and anticipatory at the start of the morning, now held the echoes of human memory, the silent acknowledgement of the past, and the gentle promise that history would continue to be remembered. Even as the crowd thinned and life in the city resumed its normal pace, the impact of the ceremony lingered. The portraits of King Charles I, the wreaths, and the small acts of reflection had created a bridge between centuries. People of all ages, backgrounds, and experiences had come together to honor history, to learn, and to connect with stories that were far older than themselves. The quiet dignity of the ceremony, the music, the words, and the actions of the participants created a memory that would remain with many long after the day had ended. In that way, the commemoration was more than an event. It was a living tribute to the past, carried forward in the hearts and minds of those who had gathered. After the formal ceremony, the crowd outside Buckingham Palace slowly began to disperse, but a quiet energy lingered in the air. People did not leave immediately. Instead, many stayed behind to reflect on what they had witnessed, to discuss the stories of King Charles I and the English Civil War, and to share personal connections with history. Small groups formed naturally, as individuals leaned in to exchange thoughts, impressions, and memories. The sense of community that had quietly grown throughout the morning now became more visible, as people of all ages and backgrounds engaged with one another. One group of older men and women gathered near the edge of the square, speaking softly about their own family histories. One man, with silver hair and a thoughtful gaze, shared that his great-great-grandfather had lived in a town affected by battles during the Civil War. He spoke of letters that had been preserved for generations, describing how his ancestor had hidden valuables, cared for neighbors, and tried to protect his family from harm. The others nodded, offering similar stories of resilience and courage. It became clear that for many attendees, the commemoration was not just about the distant past, but about connecting with their own personal histories. Each story shared added depth to the memory of King Charles I and the lives affected by the conflict. Nearby, A young woman in her 20s spoke quietly with her friends about the moral lessons she had learned from the event. She reflected on the choices faced by King Charles I, the challenges of leadership, and the consequences of decisions made under pressure. Her friends listened attentively, nodding in agreement, and one commented that even though the story was centuries old, it felt surprisingly relevant to the challenges they faced in their own lives. They discussed themes of responsibility, fairness, and the importance of understanding different perspectives. In doing so, they bridged the gap between history and the present, demonstrating how stories from the past can still offer guidance today. Children, too, were engaged in reflection, though in their own unique ways. Many still held the small, illustrated cards they had placed at the foot of the wreaths earlier in the day. They asked questions about the king, the battles, and the daily lives of people long ago. Teachers and parents answered with patience, using simple stories and comparisons to help the children understand. One child asked why King Charles I had been executed, and the teacher explained carefully that it had been a complicated time, with different groups disagreeing about how the country should be governed. The child's eyes widened in surprise, but then they nodded thoughtfully, realizing that history was not always simple or easy to understand. Even at a young age, the children were beginning to grasp the human struggles behind the stories they had learned. Throughout the square, individuals reflected in silence as well. Some found quiet corners to stand alone, closing their eyes and imagining the sounds of the past, the clatter of armor, the murmur of townsfolk, and the hush of midnight prayers during times of uncertainty. Others traced their fingers over the portraits and artifacts, letting their imagination transport them to the lives of the people they represented. A young student paused in front of a display showing soldiers, letters, reading each carefully, and then whispered softly to a companion, "I can't believe how real this feels. It's like I'm hearing their voices." Such reactions were common, demonstrating the powerful effect of connecting emotionally with history. A few attendees, historians or enthusiasts, were engaged in deeper discussions about the political and social context of the English Civil War. They spoke in measured tones, analyzing the strategies, the debates in Parliament, and the consequences of different decisions made by leaders on both sides. They discussed the complexities of loyalty, the role of religion, and the difficult choices ordinary citizens had to make. The conversation was intense but respectful, and younger listeners, intrigued by the depth of discussion, joined in with questions. The square became a living classroom, where history was not only observed but actively discussed and debated. Some families shared their reflections in more personal ways. One woman described how attending the ceremony had reminded her of her own parents, who had taught her to value fairness, integrity, and courage. She explained to her children that remembering history is important because it helps people understand the world and the consequences of choices. Her children listened quietly, occasionally asking questions, but mostly absorbing the idea that history is not just about events, but about the lessons and values we carry forward. Across the square, similar conversations were taking place, showing that the commemoration was fostering learning, reflection, and human connection on multiple levels. A particularly moving moment occurred when a man approached a small group of children to share a story he had learned from his grandmother. He spoke of a young girl during the Civil War who had helped care for her siblings while her parents were away, showing courage and responsibility at a very young age. The children listened wide-eyed, fascinated by the bravery of someone their own age. The story reminded the audience that history is not just about kings and generals, but about ordinary people whose small actions contributed to the survival and resilience of their communities. Many nodded thoughtfully, reflecting on the quiet courage that exists in everyday life, both in the past and the present. Photographers and journalists continued to move through the crowd, capturing the faces of attendees, the displays, and the quiet interactions taking place. They noticed the smiles of children as they asked questions, the thoughtful expressions of adults reflecting on stories, and the gentle gestures of connection between individuals. These images would later tell a story of remembrance that went beyond the ceremony itself, showing how history continues to engage and inspire people across generations. Even without words, the photographs captured the essence of the day, the blending of learning, reflection, and shared human experience. A quiet teacher-led group gathered near the portrait of King Charles I. The teacher encouraged students to write down what they had learned or felt about the king and the Civil War. Some wrote simple sentences about courage or fairness, while others described emotions they imagined the people of the past must have felt. The teacher read a few aloud, allowing the entire group to hear their reflections. The simple words of students often captured profound truths, reminding everyone that history is as much about feeling and understanding as it is about facts and dates. The act of sharing reflections created a chain of memory, connecting each individual with both the past and the present community of learners. As the day wore on, the crowd began to thin, but the personal stories and reflections continued to ripple through those who remained. People lingered to discuss what they had learned, to ask questions of historians, and to connect their own experiences to the lives they had studied. One woman quietly thanked the organizers, saying that the ceremony had helped her understand not just history, but humanity itself, the courage, resilience, and empathy that transcends time. Others expressed similar sentiments, noting that the stories of King Charles I and ordinary citizens alike had reminded them that the past is alive in the choices we make, the values we uphold, and the way we treat one another. Even as visitors began to leave, the atmosphere remained charged with reflection and connection. People walked slowly through the square, taking one last look at the portraits, the wreaths, and the displays. Children held the cards they had placed earlier, keeping them as reminders of what they had learned. Adults carried memories of stories, discussions, and emotions that had been stirred. Everyone seemed aware that the day had offered more than history lessons. It had provided a shared human experience, a moment to connect with lives far removed by centuries, but connected by enduring human values. The palace gates, once silent witnesses, now stood quietly behind the lingering crowd. Buckingham Palace, with its elegant facade and commanding presence, seemed to observe the human activity below, almost participating in the shared remembrance. The sunlight reflected softly off the gates, illuminating faces deep in thought, and casting a gentle glow over the remnants of the ceremony. The square, once filled with anticipatory energy, now hummed softly with quiet reflection, conversations, and the soft footsteps of those walking home. The day had unfolded in a way that honored the past while connecting it meaningfully to the present. In the end, the personal reactions of the crowd became the living memory of the day. Every whispered story, shared reflection, thoughtful glance, and quiet conversation added layers of meaning to the commemoration. Attendees left with more than knowledge. They carried empathy, understanding, and a connection to human experiences that transcended time. They had witnessed history, reflected upon it, and internalized it in a way that would stay with them long after the square had emptied. It was a reminder that the significance of history lies not only in events, but in how people connect, remember, and learn from those events. As the day drew toward evening, the square outside Buckingham Palace began to empty gradually, yet a lingering sense of reflection remained. In the air, the sun had shifted, casting warm, soft light across the stone pathways and highlighting the grand facade of the palace. Shadows stretched long, and the wind carried a cool, gentle breeze, rustling the leaves of nearby trees. Even as the crowd thinned, the The weight of the day's commemoration seemed to remain, leaving a quiet impression on those who had participated. Every person carried with them the stories, lessons, and emotions of a day spent remembering King Charles I and the events of the English Civil War. Some attendees lingered longer than others, standing quietly near the displays or portraits. A young woman rested her hand lightly on the edge of a wreath, her eyes closed, reflecting on the courage of those who had lived through turbulent times. She thought about the difficult choices King Charles I had faced, and how ordinary people had survived amid fear and uncertainty. Beside her, an older man adjusted his scarf and whispered to his companion that these stories reminded him of the importance of remembering history, not just the victories or defeats, but the experiences of the people themselves. The conversation was quiet, intimate, yet shared a sense of reverence that connected them to the past. A small group of children played gently near the side of the square, holding the cards they had placed earlier during the ceremony. Though they were young, the day had left a visible impression on them. They discussed the stories of bravery, loyalty, and kindness they had learned, and imagined themselves living in those times, helping families, hiding treasures, or protecting neighbors. Their laughter was soft and innocent, yet it carried a thoughtful undertone, as if they understood in a childlike way the meaning of courage and compassion. Teachers nearby watched with quiet satisfaction, recognizing that the lessons of the day had transcended age, planting seeds of curiosity, empathy, and historical awareness. Historians and researchers lingered to converse with each other and with curious attendees. They discussed what they had observed, the questions asked by children and adults, and the ways in which history had been interpreted and remembered. One historian pointed out that the real value of such a commemoration lies not in the ceremony itself, but in the reflections it inspires. The discussions that followed, he explained, are what make history alive, ensuring that stories of the past remain meaningful and relevant. A student, listening quietly nearby, asked questions about sources and personal accounts, and the historian patiently explained how historians gather, interpret, and preserve information. This exchange of ideas added depth to the day, emphasizing that history is not static but a living conversation across time. Families slowly made their way through the square, some holding hands tightly, others walking in quiet pairs. They reflected on the stories of King Charles I's life, the moral dilemmas of leadership, and the courage of ordinary people. Parents explain to their children that history is not just about dates or kings, but about understanding human nature, choices, and consequences. Conversations flowed naturally, touching on lessons of honesty, empathy, bravery, and responsibility. Many adults admitted that they themselves had gained new perspectives, recognizing that the past is not distant but connected to their own lives, decisions, and values. The displays and portraits remained a focal point even as most attendees departed. The images of King Charles I, the letters of soldiers, and the illustrations of daily life in the 17th century seemed to absorb the quiet attention of the few remaining visitors. One young man paused before a portrait of the king, noting the solemn expression, the intricate details of his clothing, and the intensity of his gaze. He imagined the weight of the crown on the king's head, the decisions that would affect millions, and the loneliness that must have accompanied such responsibility. The historian had spoken earlier about the humanity behind the monarchy, and now, standing in front of the painting, the young man felt a deep sense of connection to someone who lived centuries before. The atmosphere in the square was reflective, almost meditative. The sun continued its slow descent, casting golden light that highlighted the textures of the palace walls and the delicate details of the wreaths left behind. A gentle breeze moved through the crowd, carrying soft murmurs of conversation, the laughter of children, and the faint rustle of leaves. Even the pigeons, once busy with morning activity, had become quiet observers, coexisting peacefully with the human presence. It was a moment when time seemed to stretch, allowing the past and present to coexist in harmony, and giving each person a chance to consider their own role in remembering, understanding, and learning from history. Some individuals paused to record their thoughts in notebooks or on small devices, capturing reflections, ideas, and questions that had arisen during the day. One woman wrote about the courage of ordinary people and the sacrifices they had made to protect families and communities. She reflected on how these lessons could be applied to modern life, to challenges she faced personally and professionally. Another attendee wrote about the complexity of leadership, the moral dilemmas faced by King Charles I, and how history is rarely simple. These reflections illustrated how deeply the day had engaged people, prompting not only observation but thoughtful contemplation and personal growth. Even journalists and photographers who had come to document the event noted the emotional and intellectual depth of the day. Their cameras captured more than images. They captured moments of connection, reflection, and learning. A photograph of a child holding a small card with the king's portrait beside a wreath conveyed both innocence and understanding. A snapshot of an elderly man discussing historical letters with a young student illustrated the passing of knowledge and respect across generations. These images would later tell a story not only of a ceremony, but of the human impact of remembering history in a meaningful, shared way. As the evening approached, the historian who had guided much of the day addressed the few remaining attendees. He thanked them for participating, for reflecting, and for carrying forward the lessons of history. He reminded them that remembering King Charles I and the English Civil War is not about glorifying conflict or power, but about understanding humanity, our choices, our responsibilities, and the values that guide us. The crowd listened quietly, absorbing the message and reflecting on how they could apply these lessons to their own lives. The historian's words lingered, connecting past and present in a way that felt deeply personal and universally relevant. The palace gates, bathed in the warm glow of the late afternoon sun, seemed almost to glow with the memory of the day. Attendees paused one last time, taking in the grandeur of Buckingham Palace and the quiet dignity of the square. Some looked back at the portraits, the wreaths, and the small displays, feeling a sense of continuity, that the past had been honored, understood, and preserved in memory. Children clutched their cards, adults carried thoughts and reflections, and families walked together slowly, appreciating the lessons they had learned. It was a day that would remain in their hearts long after the square had emptied. As people departed, conversations continued to flow naturally. Strangers discussed their impressions, families compared notes, and children excitedly shared stories they had imagined about the lives of people in the 17th century. Even casual passers-by who had stopped to watch briefly were drawn into the atmosphere, leaving with a sense of curiosity and respect for the history they had witnessed. The day had created connections, not just between people and the past, but between individuals in the present, fostering understanding, empathy, and shared learning. The quiet energy of reflection persisted even after the last few attendees left. The palace gates stood tall and silent, the portraits and displays remained in place, and the wreaths marked the memory of a long-ago king and the lives touched by war. The square itself seemed to hold the day's energy, a testament to the power of remembrance. It was a space where time had intertwined, where centuries-old stories met modern hearts and minds, and where history was not simply observed but truly felt. For those who had participated, the day offered more than information about battles, kings, or political struggles. It provided insight into human courage, empathy, and resilience. It reminded attendees that the past continues to influence the present, that understanding history allows people to make thoughtful decisions today, and that the lives of ordinary people are just as important as those of rulers and generals. Every story shared, every reflection spoken, and every quiet observation added depth to this understanding. History became a living, breathing presence, felt not just in the mind but in the heart. As dusk approached, the soft golden light gave way to the cooler tones of early evening. The square, once filled with the energy of learning and reflection, grew quieter, carrying with it the sense of meaning that had permeated the day. Attendees walked away slowly, some silently reflecting, others discussing plans to continue learning, research family history, or share the lessons with friends and colleagues. The memory of King Charles I, the courage of ordinary citizens, and the complexities of the English Civil War had become a shared experience, linking the past to the present in a deeply personal and lasting way. In the end, the commemoration was more than a ceremony. It was a bridge between centuries, a reminder that human experiences, courage, responsibility, empathy, and reflection, are timeless. Every person who participated carried a piece of that history with them, and every act of remembrance, no matter how small, contributed to keeping the memory alive. Buckingham Palace, standing silently in the evening light, seemed to embody the same message, that history is preserved not just in buildings, books, or portraits, but in the hearts and minds of those who choose to remember, reflect, and learn. Even after the square emptied, the day's impact remained. Stories would be retold, reflections shared, and lessons applied in homes, classrooms, and communities. The memory of King Charles I and the English Civil War had found a living presence in the people of today, a reminder that history is not distant or irrelevant, but alive and meaningful. In this way, the commemoration outside Buckingham Palace fulfilled its purpose, not just as an event, but as a lasting human connection to the past, a celebration of resilience and reflection, and a reminder that memory shapes the future as much as it preserves the past.